Recently, as we all know, the discussion around Pixar online and among friends hasn't been quite positive. Elemental didn't open well, where it seems to be slowly recovering over time, and other stories like Lightyear just really didn't impress. And coupled with the fact that the studio had a massive layoff a little while ago, it really seemed that Pixar isn't the big juggernaut it used to be, and we kind of have to accept that their greatest era isn't here anymore. But thinking about that really got me thinking about that and revisiting those very stories of old. The time where Pixar came into its own and became a powerhouse, birthing a new age of animation similar to what Disney did in the early 40s with their own golden age. And now, with Pixar, the picture has been clear, showcasing that they have entered their new own separate eras like Disney has done, where the golden age was one of the best in all of modern animation. And that's something I wanted to revisit today, to remind us of the time period that Pixar managed to capture everyone's hearts and attention for this brand new medium that was never done before with the likes of Toy Story. And remember, despite the mixed era that Pixar is in now and the sequel era that we have just came out of, the studio still has managed to produce the best animated stories ever. The recent one might not as be great as these ones of the golden age, but they are still good overall and not overall bad either, except for a couple few. And that is pretty amazing feat amongst the other mixed reception that other studios like Disney has actually have. But anyways, Toy Story remained to be the perfect beginning for this studio to come into the fold, where despite it not being their best story compared to its sequels, it was still a groundbreaking starting point for the new era of animation and storytelling that we see today. And using 3D to tell the story about toys actually really worked quite well because of how believable it was. They revealed to us the hidden world that we usually leave behind, and it was done through the use of this new animation to make it all blend so great. And of course, the charm of this movie relied on the relationship of Buzz and Woody and how both of them actually learned and grow about the purpose of being a toy. Both presented as very arrogant, where Buzz is just ignorant to the fact that he is a child's plaything and not a real space ranger, and Woody is just afraid of being forgotten and losing the limelight after connecting and being Andy's favorite toy, which is a theme that would stick throughout the course of the series. And the other toys are really creative and funny in their own right, where you understand their antagonism to Woody because he was sort of an antagonist on his own in some way, but all of them still come to learn from their mistakes and help each other out, which would become important as the sequels would trek along. All of what Toy Story did just had the proper ingredients for success and established Pixar as the new kids in town and one that Disney would foresee for the foreseeable future. And this leads us to newer films like Bug's Life. And Bug's Life started to cement Pixar's image as the studio that brings other worlds to life that we don't see. I mean, bugs are indeed alive in real life, but everything gets anthropomorphized to a certain degree in their world that has elements of connectability to them. And of course, this is where Pixar started to create such fantastic villains as well. Toy Story only tested the waters with Sid, but now we are getting something that is more directly affecting those around him throughout the entire course of the film, where what we got was a fantastic menacing presence in Hopper, played by the one and only infamous Kevin Spacey. Its story is far from the best thing, but everything about Flick's journey is really charming and endearing to watch. It's how they managed to make things larger than life in the literal sense, considering we are seeing at the Bugs View level throughout, and it's just how they present the fun new ways that they were able to create the hidden world and something you never saw before, and one that continued to live on, continuing the blueprint and template of what their stories were about. Of course, this leads us back to Toy Story 2, where they took the elements that they learned from Bug's Life and put it back into a story that everyone fell in love with in the beginning. Seeing Woody and Buzz's relationship develop from the first, where Woody constantly struggles with being discarded and forgotten. And that point was done so well to introduce us to new characters like Jessie, Bullseye, and Stinky Pete, the gang of Woody's roundup, where we finally continued having another great villain that now was a toy rather than a human bully. This is just a movie that offers everything you want in a sequel, something that Toy Story would be extremely good at doing from the original, and it is very astonishing that that has happened and it was underproduced by Disney, setting the stage for other 3D movies and sequels that would surpass their original in a lot of good ways. This is where we got to explore more of the other toys having more to do, going through the adventure to rescue Woody and helping him, realizing the value of what a toy brings that some never experienced and rejected throughout their entire life. It's the way that they expanded upon the ideals to the first and added to the development of the characters that made Toy Story 2 a brilliant sequel that does right by its ideals. And of course, this is the first instance where Pixar would start digging at your heart with the emotions the main characters go through, especially with what they did with Jessie and resolving that by having her join the gang at the end of the movie. Just a fantastic heartwarming adventure that set the standard, leading the way for Monsters Inc. to come through. And Monsters Inc. is truly a Pixar classic, where it remains to be the most fun I've ever had with a Pixar movie and the friendship of Mike and Sully. It's an interesting look on how the monster world works similar to ours and finding the reason they scare us as kids during the night during our nightmares, where they just use that for their energy and to run a business like Monsters Incorporated. They do it out of the necessity of their everyday life and not because they're just terrifying evil creatures. Because we do learn that people like Sully have such big hearts when he's tasked to get a human child back home when he accidentally lets her in, leading him to grow and protect her while discovering that laughter actually provides more, while revealing what his boss has resorted to go through with his desperate measures to save the company, where she was going to be kidnapped by Water News to keep their company alive in this energy crisis. It's how they were able to learn from the previous two stories that made this one more special, adding heart to it, adding twist, and adding a menacing threat that showed their ever-improving power coming into a decade that they would fully dominate in storytelling. And that dominance at the box office exploded when their next story was in fact Finding Nemo, becoming the second highest grossing film of 2003. And Nemo decided to establish Pixar's emotional dominance that connected well to its audience and made them tear up so well, mainly about a father-son story, losing something then finding it along the way in plenty of different ways for both our main characters in Marlin and Nemo. And of course, Dory was also a delight and addition with her short-term memory loss traversing through the ocean and helping Marlin through the Great Barrier Reef to get to P. Sherman 42 Wallaby Way, Sydney. The way that they use several different environments under the sea really makes the journey stand out more, making it more difficult for characters like Marlin who aren't used to traversing much of this world so difficult, but he still does it because of what happened to his wife and his other unborn children, to protect Nemo throughout his life and try to hold on to what he lost. It really does prove how much capable they were at family stories as much as Disney has had, and one that they would continue on later throughout this era. And of course, its cast of side characters were also great too, the tank gang helping Nemo out from getting into Darla's hands and life inside an aquarium tank, to the sharks devoted to becoming friends with fish, despite having those killer instincts with a sniff of blood. And so going back to the family point we started with Finding Nemo, brings us to the greatest masterpiece in The Incredibles. This takes their story to a brand new level with a family dynamic meshed with the world of supers, which was just starting to pop off, and it worked really well. It told a story that was more mature in most of its themes in the most subtle ways, making the scenes really easy for kids to understand when Mr. Incredible works in this dull world of insurance companies and their horrible practices while complaining about society's needless celebration of mediocrity. Every single power they present is used in this relatable fashion to how families work with the dynamic of fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers and babies. It's one that feels modern and retro without distinctly taking place in a definitive era, which was something that a lot of people could easily connect with considering the time period they decided to set this in. Just every element in the film is so explosive, and Michael Giacchino's score is really the pinnacle of what superhero storytelling provides, one that is without a doubt one of the greatest superhero movies of all time, where also they managed to provide us with one of the greatest supervillains of all time, being Mr. Incredible's biggest fan, who turned out to be a syndrome and a super genius who had the power to wipe out almost all of the other supers and almost succeeded before his own inventions actually turned on him, because no supers should actually be able to wear capes. A great way to end the middle part of the 2000s and the first entire decade with such powerful storytelling. But of course, like the Disney Renaissance in this case, not every story could work to a great degree where they eventually were going to have their own Pocahontas in Cars. But unlike Pocahontas, Cars wasn't actually boring and actually had a lot of charm to it and a lot of fun to it. It may not be well liked or emotionally compelling as what Pixar has provided throughout the course of their existence, with a world that has numerous problems, but it still remained to be a really fun time and a respect to the motor world as a whole, with the tributes to Route 66 portrayed in towns like Radiator Springs, and it really still remains to be a great time to this day with family. It just was the most thrilling Pixar attraction, and one that still had a unique journey of growth when cars like Lightning McQueen were just beginning learning in their careers to becoming a great racer, and understanding that with characters like Doc Hudson and the rest of the town of Radiator Springs. It's the world of appreciation that matters in Cars, and it's why I always actually had a liking to it. I like the history of the interstate and the automobile, and seeing it portrayed in this lifelike way was just really neat. And although the villain wasn't compelling as the others, he too was actually also very fun, where no villain in Cars has actually been ever able to impress since, because no Cars can deliver lines like Kachiga the way Michael Keaton did as Chick Hicks. But then after this, Pixar would be back to delivering bangers like Ratatouille, their second greatest film ever and one of the greatest masterpieces in animation of all time. And Ratatouille really takes that message message that anyone can cook to a very relatable level in the most unlikely way that the fact that they use a rat for its main character. And somehow with the rat and the talent of director Brad Bird, we still have a mature story to some degree like The Incredibles in the realm of culinary arts and critics, and using that message to apply to anyone in particular of any art at all. The message that anyone can cook really means a lot if you replace the word cook with anything else, where the abilities Remy demonstrates shows how people in the most unlikely situations can actually thrive if they actually choose to pour their passion into it. And making the story take place in Paris really enhances those very details, contrasting with various characters that you would find, like a short-tempered chef who wants to sell frozen microwave burritos to a heartless critic with a brooding ego who changes his heart at the end to realize what the artists and chefs like Gusteau really meant. It's a really endearing story that remains to be the peak of either Pixar or Disney storytelling, and one that will remain too hard to actually top. And once again, you have to credit the score of Michael Giacchino to bring that spice to life in both senses of the word, if you know what I mean, adding those flavors of the kitchen and the fires of the grill to create the most delectable ingredients that you have ever tasted, being one of those movies that makes you crave more, that makes you want to savor every last drop or frame. And then your heart gets struck when they move on to the next story hundreds of years into the future with WALL-E, presenting a world of trash and abandoned and only inhabited by a singular robot who still collects those trash. But this robot actually has a lot of heart to it in many ways, being the cutest Pixar protagonist that was ever made, who seeks nothing but love, collecting every piece of human treasure and finally finding that with an ethereal angel named Eve, a newer robot seeking for ways to return humanity back home. This is a story that I take to heart with its messages and the way they present it as a real story, making use of the live action humans to showcase the state of the world we left it in when we allowed megacorps like By and Large take over and cause such complacency in a world of increased technology, and finding that aboard ships in the Axiom in this animated state, seeing humanity far gone from where we left them off, finding again slowly through the actions of WALL-E. This is where we come to understand the beauty of such relationships and the care we used to have, our home and our place that we have found that the powers of that love actually provides. It's an interesting story that can both be a romantical love story and a cautionary tale about what can happen if we do nothing to stop the negative advances and complacency of man. But overall, it still remains to be the best because Pixar provided how much that they could do with a love story with robots that don't say much, more so than what Disney has ever done with their multitude of prince or princesses love stories. Not that I hate most of them, but just how much Pixar proves that they can make you love them even more. And you kind of continue that with the spirit of adventure with Up, a classic that gets me to tears on several occasions throughout the story of Ellie and Carl, and learning to move on from that point when she passes on. This is where we find life in the young with Russell and birds like Kevin, where Carl decides to take his adventures and dreams to Paradise Falls with his house floating with a bunch of balloons, exploring the very interesting yet dangerous wilderness that he grew up with, and of course seeing how that can corrupt a man's heart like Charles Muntz over the many years he took to find a singular bird to clear his name for the sake of finding adventure that was out there. And of course, who doesn't actually love a good talking dog? Here, it's done in a very realistic way without remotely speaking, but doing so with their colors. It's an interesting way to deliver the story and charm within grumpy old adults like Carl, who learns to love again over time in a different way rather than romance. How you learn to continue living on in the spirit of adventure in more ways than one. But sadly, with all of these emotional beats we have gotten, we eventually had to end things in the golden age about 15 years after Toy Story with in fact Toy Story 3. And in my opinion, this actually does suit as the perfect conclusion to this entire golden age era of film, showcasing how far they came in animation from the first and still providing a perfect story along with it. It was just astounding how they still continued to create sequels that were masterpieces in their own right in the Toy Story franchise, where it actually made sense to continue with its very themes and finally growing up as most of us did. Many who saw the first were now in Andy's position, going off in the world to college and other stuff, where the toys eventually learned to move on too. And characters like Lotso represent the sheltered mindset of abandonment that Stinky Pete introduced to us to another interesting level, making him a tyrant who could never let go because of his bitter loss he never actually understood, where Woody actually grows once again to understand the purpose of being a toy despite his owner now being too old for them now, and the others just getting to learn this as well, finding it through the use of this young girl in Bonnie. It just made so much sense to do this to finally end the story that we love and held so dear, finding new ways to introduce new toys and new worlds while concluding the one we began with, where the final scene that Andy gets to say goodbye and hands them to Bonnie is one of the best endings to a movie that could ever be done. And I couldn't be grateful for such a conclusion that I still tear a little bit towards towards 13 years later. But then it all went down from here with Cars 2. But anyways, Pixar's golden age remains to be the pinnacle and true birth of 3D storytelling with the most greatest stories that were ever made. A true testament to their power as a studio, reminiscent of Disney's own success back in their golden age and of course in the Renaissance itself. And of course, despite the shortcomings of sequels and other lackluster movies, most of what Pixar would still produce wouldn't be overall bad. They just remain to be a studio you couldn't hate, where it's just the overall company decisions that affects things for the worse, where if Disney managed to clean up things for the better for every company that they actually own, then they would still remain to be a big powerhouse, but just isn't anymore because of the rest of the world quickly adapting to this very style of animation. But in the end, this resume still remained to be well liked in the people's hearts and will continue to do so for many years to come. With that said, this has been a look at the fantastic golden age of Pixar, so I'm all done. Goodbye.